Today we're talking about how passive transport takes place so we can understand how chemicals get transported across membranes. Our success criteria is being able to identify how membranes can differentiate between particles and being able to describe both concentration gradients and diffusion. So cells can determine which types of molecules they're going to let in or keep out based off of size, shape, and charge. Any one of those three different qualities can prevent a chemical from crossing through the cell membrane. But those properties can also be used to identify those chemicals using special channels that do allow them to cross. So movement across the cell membrane because of this is known as selective transport, because it doesn't just let anything through. It checks the identities of each particle and only let those particles through that it needs. Sometimes this doesn't take energy, which is passive transport, which we're talking about today. Other times it does take energy, which is called active transport, which we'll discuss later. So an important thing to remember is that particles are always in motion. Even solids, although most of the time we care about liquids and gases, always have constant particle motion that we call Brownian motion. Now, the important thing about Brownian motion is that it is random. However, because you often have chemicals more concentrated in one area, that random motion causes particles to spread out over time. If you spray a very strong scent in one corner of a room, you will eventually be able to smell it at the other corner of the room, and the intensity of the smell will be in the same in both locations. This is due to Brownian motion. The particles do randomly spread out, which means they can go backwards to where the smell is more concentrated, but that greater concentration is also more likely to push a wave of chemical in front of it. And pretty much all chemicals work the same way. As long as it's a liquid or a gas, it will spread out and even out over time. Solids, of course, don't do that because solids can hold their shape. What we call this is a concentration gradient. And the way that biologists and biochemists speak is they often say chemicals will move with the concentration gradient or down the concentration gradient. What that means is that chemicals, through their Brownian motion, move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So because you could visualize that as high concentration being high up on a graph and low concentration being low down on a graph, we often say particles will move down the concentration gradient towards the lower side of the graph. Another way you can say it is that the concentration gradient is the natural movement, and particles will, at least in passive transport, move with the concentration gradient. We'll also see later that active transport can cause chemicals to move against the concentration gradient and move from low concentration to high concentration. Whenever we get chemicals evenly distributed, we reach a state of equilibrium. So if you dissolve Kool-Aid or Tang or whatever into water, over time it spreads out evenly and all of it looks like it's one substance. It becomes a solution. The Kool-Aid is the solute and the water is the solvent. And chemicals in cells work the exact same way. Same thing with outside of cells, and cell membranes use that to their advantage. So because this type of movement doesn't require any energy, we say it is a form of passive transport. We call it diffusion because it's diffusing from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Diffuse just means to spread out. There are other types of transport that are also no energy uses, passive transport. So we've talked about diffusion. We can also have osmosis, and we can have facilitated diffusion. So diffusion does happen across cell membranes. Chemicals that have a high concentration outside of the cell can move into the cell across the membrane where there's a lower concentration. Typically, this is going to be small molecules. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are two great examples. They're small enough they can just pass through the cell membrane and diffuse across it. And for oxygen's case, since we are constantly consuming oxygen, it never actually reaches equilibrium. We always have a low concentration of oxygen in our cells because we're constantly using it up. So oxygen will always move from our red blood cells into our body cells. And carbon dioxide's the opposite. We're always producing carbon dioxide, so there's always a relatively high concentration in our cells, even as it diffuses out into the blood to be carried away and expelled through the lungs.